In this podcast episode, Tony Aguilar, a retired U.S. Army lieutenant colonel and Green Beret with 25 years of combat experience, shares his firsthand account of the humanitarian crisis and alleged war crimes he witnessed while working in Gaza earlier in 2025. Aguilar's military career is distinguished by extensive combat deployments and decorations, including a Purple Heart and Bronze Star for valor. After retiring in early 2025, he was unexpectedly contacted by UG Solutions, a security subcontractor involved in aid distribution in Gaza under the auspices of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF. Prior to this, Aguilar was unaware of GHF or UG Solutions, but was drawn to the mission out of a sense of duty and compassion, motivated by the Special Forces motto, De oppresso liber, to free the oppressed. He emphasizes that his involvement was apolitical and driven by a desire to help starving civilians caught in the conflict, not by any ideological agenda. GHF was established to replace the United Nations aid delivery mechanism after it was cut off, with the goal of distributing humanitarian aid in Gaza. However, Aguilar quickly realized that the operation was deeply flawed, poorly planned, and dangerously intertwined with ongoing military combat operations. Upon arriving in Gaza, Aguilar describes the landscape as post-apocalyptic, with entire neighborhoods, especially in southern areas like Rafah, reduced to rubble. The destruction is total, with no buildings left standing and personal belongings strewn among the debris, symbolizing the obliteration of civilian life and dignity. He compares the scene to a war zone unlike any he has witnessed in his extensive military career, surpassing the devastation he saw in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Aguilar stresses that the civilian population is suffering immensely with widespread starvation and deprivation. He notes that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's aid distribution is grossly insufficient, providing food for only a fraction of the population and failing to deliver essential items such as water, medicine, fuel, and hygiene products. The aid sites themselves are dangerously located, with 3 out of 4 distribution centers situated within active combat zones in southern Gaza, collocated with Israeli Defense Forces, IDF units, conducting offensive operations. This, Aguilar asserts, constitutes a war crime under the Geneva Conventions, which prohibit placing humanitarian operations in combat zones. Aguilar reveals that all 314 contractors working on the ground for UG Solutions are American, many of whom are combat veterans like himself. They enter Israel on tourist visas, armed with military-grade weapons, yet operate under a hastily assembled and loosely regulated framework. He highlights the troubling fact that the United States government is funding this operation, effectively complicit in the ongoing violence and humanitarian crisis. He also points out the stark contrast between the IDF's treatment of Palestinians and the purported mission of humanitarian aid. Israeli soldiers on the ground openly question why Americans are feeding our enemy, reflecting a dehumanizing attitude toward the Palestinian population. Aguilar condemns this mindset, emphasizing that the civilians, women, children, elderly, and disabled, are not combatants and should not be treated as enemies. Aguilar provides a vivid account of the chaotic and dangerous conditions at the aid distribution sites. Palestinians must walk 8 to 12 kilometers through militarized corridors to reach the southern distribution centers, where thousands gather in desperate queues. The IDF controls these crowds with lethal force, firing machine guns, mortars, and tank rounds into the air and at the feet of civilians to control their movement. Despite claims that shots are fired only as warnings, Aguilar documents that this indiscriminate shooting results in civilian deaths and injuries, including the tragic killing of a young boy named Amir. Amir's story is particularly poignant. Aguilar personally interacted with the emaciated child, who showed profound respect and gratitude despite his dire condition. After receiving aid, Amir was shot and killed by IDF forces as he left the distribution site, a victim of reckless and undisciplined military tactics. Aguilar condemns the use of such force against unarmed civilians and calls the distribution sites death traps designed without regard for human life. Throughout the interview, Aguilar repeatedly references the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law, underscoring that many actions by the IDF and the aid operation violate these legal standards. He highlights the displacement of the civilian population, the use of razor wire around civilian aid sites, which is banned, and the classification of the entire Gaza population as Hamas, all of which constitute war crimes. Aguilar is clear that these violations are not accidental, but stem from either gross negligence or intentional policy decisions. He calls for accountability and transparency, criticizing the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's lack of openness about its funding, operations, and leadership. He notes that key figures, including the foundation's leader and consulting groups, have resigned over ethical concerns, further casting doubt on the organization's legitimacy. Aguilar attributes much of the crisis to failures in leadership on both the Israeli and American sides. He describes the IDF units deployed in southern Gaza as reserve conscripts lacking proper training, leadership, and discipline, which contributes to the reckless use of force against civilians. Similarly, he criticizes the leadership of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and its contractors for poor planning, inadequate resources, and disregard for humanitarian principles. Despite these failures, Aguilar expresses sympathy for the soldiers on the ground, caught in untenable situations without clear guidance. He stresses that the problem is systemic and requires urgent reform and accountability at the highest levels. In closing, Aguilar urges the United States government to immediately cease funding the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and to reinstate the United Nations aid delivery mechanism, which he believes is far better equipped to handle the scale and complexity of Gaza's humanitarian needs. He calls for a comprehensive aid operation capable of delivering hundreds of trucks daily to hundreds of sites, including essential supplies beyond food.